The first burst didn't sound like gunfire. It sounded like the air itself was tearing apart. Across the jungle clearing, 3 palm trees exploded into splinters. A Japanese machine gun nest vanished in a chain of white flashes. The men who'd been firing from it were gone before the echo reached the American line. Sergeant Howard Keller lowered his hand from the trigger and stared at what he'd just done. He'd fired a machine gun, but what came out wasn't bullets. It was thunder. Bougainville Island, November 1943. The war in the Pacific had become a grinding contest of fortified positions, dense jungle, and invisible enemies. The Japanese had learned to dig in deep, to wait, to let the Americans come to them. Every ridge was a killing ground. Every clearing had a bunker. And every assault meant walking into a wall of fire you couldn't see until it opened up. The Marines and Army infantry were paying for every 100 yards with blood. Standard tactics weren't working. Suppressive fire from .30 caliber Browning M1919 machine. Guns could pin an enemy down, but it couldn't dig them out. Not when they were dug into coral and log bunkers 20 feet underground. Not when they had interlocking fields of fire and were willing to die in place. Someone in ordnance had an idea. If you couldn't penetrate the bunker, maybe you could shatter the men inside it. Maybe you could make them too terrified to fight. The idea wasn't new. Explosive and incendiary ammunition had been used in aircraft for years. But no one had seriously tried feeding it through a ground-based, belt-fed machine gun in sustained combat. Until now, a crate arrived at the forward supply depot on Bougainville with no official paperwork. Inside were belts of .30-06 ammunition that looked wrong. The rounds were slightly longer. The tips were painted red and blue. And when you shook one, you could hear something shifting inside. Fulminate of mercury. A tiny bursting charge designed to explode on impact. Not enough to destroy a tank, but more than enough to destroy a human body, or a wooden position, or a man's will to fight. Howard Keller had been a factory foreman in Pennsylvania before the war. He understood machines. He understood systems. He understood when something was built right and when it was jury-rigged and dangerous. When his lieutenant handed him the first belt of explosive rounds and told him to load them into his M1919, Keller stood there for a long time just looking at the ammunition. He'd been firing this gun for 8 months. He knew its rhythm, its heat patterns, its tolerance. He knew exactly how much punishment the barrel could take before it started to warp. Explosive rounds generated more pressure, more friction, more heat. If the barrel couldn't handle it, the gun would cook off or blow apart in his hands. But they weren't asking him if it was safe. They were telling him to try it, because if it worked, it might save lives. American lives. And that was all that mattered out here. The first test firing happened at dawn in a clearing behind the lines. Keller set up the M1919 on its tripod, fed the belt through, checked the headspace twice, and braced himself. His assistant gunner crouched low beside him, hands over his ears. Keller thumbed the safety off and squeezed the trigger. The gun roared, but it wasn't the familiar rattling bark of a Browning. It was sharper, louder. Each round left the barrel and detonated 30 yards downrange in a burst of white fire and black smoke. The dirt erupted in overlapping craters. A log they'd set up as a target didn't just splinter, it disintegrated. Keller released the trigger, and the jungle went silent again. His ears were ringing. His hands were shaking. The barrel was glowing dull red, but the gun was intact. It had worked. 2 days later, they used it in combat for the first time. A Japanese platoon was dug in along a ridgeline overlooking the main supply route. They had mortars, light machine guns, and a clear line of sight on anything trying to move up the trail. 3 previous attempts to dislodge them had failed. Each time, the Americans had been forced to pull back under fire, dragging their wounded with them. This time, Keller's squad moved up under cover of darkness and set up the M1919 on a low-rise 200 yards out. The plan was simple. Wait until the Japanese opened fire on the next patrol. Then hit them with everything. When dawn came, a rifle squad moved up the trail as bait. Right on schedule, the Japanese machine gun opened up. Keller didn't wait for orders. He opened fire. The first burst walked across the ridge like a string of firecrackers. Explosions rippled through the foliage. The enemy machine gun went silent. Keller adjusted his aim and fired again. This time he raked the entire tree line. Every fifth round was explosive. The effect was devastating. Trees splintered. Dirt fountained into the air. And men screamed. Not the short, clipped shouts of soldiers taking cover. Long, ragged screams of men who didn't understand what was happening to them. Keller kept firing, belt after belt. The barrel was smoking now, shimmering with heat. His assistant fed the ammunition in smooth, practiced motions, careful not to let the belt twist or snag. Across the ridge, the Japanese position was coming apart. Explosions blossomed in clusters. A secondary blast suggested they'd hit a mortar stockpile. When the gun finally fell silent, the jungle was burning. The rifle squad moved up cautiously, rifles ready. They found the position abandoned, or rather, evacuated by the dead. Bodies lay scattered in pieces. Foxholes had collapsed inward. Equipment was shredded, and there wasn't a single intact defensive position left. The Japanese hadn't retreated. They'd fled. Word spread fast. Within a week, every line company wanted explosive ammunition for their machine guns. Ordnance couldn't produce it fast enough, but the guns that got it became priority assets. Squads would trade cigarettes, rations, even captured swords for a few belts of the red-tipped rounds. The Japanese began calling it the Thunder Machine, not because of the sound, though that was part of it, but because of the effect. Like a lightning strike that kept happening over and over in the same spot. Bunkers that had held for days collapsed in minutes. Snipers abandoned positions after a single burst. And banzai charges, the terrifying human wave attacks that had defined Japanese infantry tactics, began to falter before they even reached American lines. Because now, the men charging across open ground weren't just facing bullets. They were facing explosions. Dozens of them, all at once. Keller's gun became famous in the battalion. Other sergeants came to watch him work, to see how he loaded the belts, how he controlled the rate of fire, to keep the barrel from overheating, how he walked the bursts across a target to maximize effect without wasting ammunition. He didn't enjoy the attention. He didn't like what the gun did to people, but he understood its value. Every attack his gun stopped was an attack his friends didn't have to face hand-to-hand. Every bunker his gun destroyed was a bunker they didn't have to assault with grenades and flamethrowers. The explosive rounds were brutal, but they saved lives. American lives. And out here, that was the only math that mattered. But there was a cost. The barrels wore out faster. After 200 rounds of sustained fire, the rifling began to erode. After 500, accuracy dropped. After 1,000, the barrel had to be replaced or the gun became dangerous to its own crew. Keller went through 4 barrels in 3 weeks. Each time, he'd pull the glowing steel tube off the receiver and drop in the dirt to cool, then slide a fresh one into place and keep firing. The gun was eating itself, but it was also eating the enemy. And that trade-off, harsh as it was, kept them alive. By mid-December, the Japanese had adjusted. They stopped massing in fixed positions. They spread out, dug deeper, used more camouflage, attacked at night when the explosive rounds were harder to aim. But the Thunder Machine had already changed the battlefield. It had proven that innovation didn't always come from headquarters or labs. Sometimes it came from a foreman turned sergeant who understood machines and was willing to risk his life testing an idea no one had officially approved. The M1919 with explosive rounds was never standardized. It was never mass-produced, but it stayed in use throughout the Pacific Campaign wherever ammunition could be scrounged or manufactured locally. And the men who used it, like Keller, became known for one thing. When they opened fire, the enemy didn't just take cover. They ran. But that wasn't the only innovation born out of desperation in the Pacific, because while Keller was perfecting the art of explosive suppression, another weapon was being tested on a different island. One that didn't just sound like thunder. It sounded like the end of the world. Saipan, June 1944. The invasion was 3 days old and already behind schedule. The Japanese had fortified the island with a depth and ferocity no one had anticipated. Every cave was a bunker. Every ridge was a fortress. And the Marines were dying in droves trying to push inland. Machine gun fire was constant, not scattered bursts, but sustained, overlapping fields that turned open ground into death zones. Standard doctrine called for suppressing enemy machine guns with your own, then advancing under that cover. But suppression only worked if the enemy stayed down. And the Japanese weren't staying down. They'd fire, take casualties, and keep firing until they were overrun. Then the next position would open up, and the whole process would start again. Corporal Daniel Ruiz had been a mechanic in Los Angeles before the war. He understood engines, torque, cooling systems, and stress limits. When he saw the triple-barrel M2 Browning mounted on the back of a half-track rolling off a landing craft, he thought it was a mistake. 3.50 caliber machine, guns welded together on a single rotating mount, fed by 3 separate ammunition belts, designed for anti-aircraft use. But someone had decided to aim it horizontally. Ruiz's first thought was that it would jam. His second thought was that it would overheat. His third thought was that if it actually worked, it would be the most terrifying weapon on the island. The triple mount had been cobbled together by Navy machinists on the transport ship during the crossing. There were no official blueprints, no manual, no training. Just 3 M2 Brownings bolted to a rotary frame with a hand wheel for traverse and a foot pedal for elevation. The trigger was a single lever that fired all 3 guns simultaneously. Or at least, that was the idea. In practice, the guns fire in perfect sync. There was a fractional delay between them, a stagger caused by tiny differences in belt tension and firing pin timing. But that stagger, accidental as it was, turned out to be the weapon's greatest strength, because it didn't sound like 3 guns. It sounded like 30. Ruiz was assigned to crew the weapon on its first combat deployment. He didn't volunteer. He was ordered. His lieutenant looked him in the eye and said, "You're the only one here who won't break it in the first 5 minutes." Ruiz nodded. He didn't argue. He climbed onto the half-track, studied the mount, checked the belt feeds, and test-fired each gun individually. They worked. Barely. The traverse was stiff. The elevation pedal stuck. And the ammunition belts had a tendency to twist if you fed them too fast. But they worked. Then he fired all 3 at once. The half-track rocked backward. The noise was unreal. A sustained, chainsaw roar that drowned out everything else on the beach. Tracers streaked downrange in 3 parallel lines, converging on a wrecked bunker 200 yards out. The bunker didn't just get hit. It got shredded. Concrete dust filled the air. Rebar bent and snapped. And in 5 seconds, the entire structure looked like it had been hit by an artillery barrage. The first real engagement came the next morning. A Marine rifle company was pinned down in a cane field by 2 Japanese machine gun nests on a hill. The nests were dug in behind log and earth revetments and had interlocking fields of fire. Every time Marines tried to advance, they got cut down. Mortars couldn't reach the angle. Artillery was too slow, and close air support was grounded by weather. The company commander called for the half-track. Ruiz's driver threaded to the jungle trails and pulled up to a ridge overlooking the hill. Ruiz spun the mount, lined up the first nest, and pressed the trigger. All 3 M2s opened fire at once. The effect was immediate and total. The revetment exploded. Logs flew apart. Dirt geysered into the air. And the machine gun inside went silent. Ruiz shifted aim and hit the second nest. Same result. 6 seconds of fire, and both positions were gone. Not suppressed. Not damaged. Gone. The Marines in the field didn't move at first. They just stared. Then someone shouted, "Go! Go! Go!" And they were up and running, rifles ready, but there was no one left to fight. The Japanese gunners were dead or scattered. The positions were rubble, and the entire engagement, start to finish, had taken less than a minute. When the rifle company reached the hill, they found something strange. Spent shell casings. Hundreds of them, but not in 2 piles. In dozens, scattered across the slope, like someone had fired from every angle at once. The Japanese survivors, interrogated later, said they thought they were facing a platoon-sized machine gun unit. 3 guns, 10 guns, maybe more. They couldn't tell. All they knew was that the moment the firing started, resistance was pointless. Ruiz fired the Triple Mount 11 more times over the next week. Every time, the result was the same. Positions that should have taken hours to reduce were neutralized in seconds. Bonsai charges that should have reached American lines disintegrated halfway across the field. And Japanese morale, already strained, began to crack. Because there was no defense against it. You couldn't hide from it. You couldn't outrun it. And you couldn't suppress it, because by the time you located the source, it had already moved or gone silent. The gun became a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. The mere rumor that the 3-gun was nearby was enough to make some units withdraw. But the weapon had limits. The barrels overheated after 90 seconds of sustained fire. The mount was fragile and required constant adjustment. And the half-track was a target. Japanese artillery zeroed in on it twice. Snipers took shots at Ruiz every time he stood up in the turret. And once, a knee mortar round landed 5 feet away and peppered the side of the vehicle with shrapnel. Ruiz took a piece in his shoulder, but stayed on the gun. He didn't have a choice. If he left, no one else knew how to keep it running. By the time Saipan was declared secure, the Triple Mount had fired over 40,000 rounds. It had destroyed 27 confirmed machine gun positions, broken up 6 bonsai charges, and supported 11 separate assaults. It had also burned through 9 barrels, cracked 2 receiver blocks, and nearly killed Ruiz 4 times. But it had worked, and more importantly, it had saved lives. Marine casualties in sectors supported by the Triple Mount were 30% lower than those without it. That number, cold and clinical as it was, meant something. It meant men went home. It meant letters got written. It meant the war moved forward. After Saipan, the Triple Mount was pulled back for evaluation. Ordnance wanted to standardize it, turn it into an official weapon system. But the test revealed what Ruiz already knew. It was too fragile, too maintenance-heavy, too dependent on a single skilled operator. Mass production wasn't feasible, so the weapon was quietly retired. The mount was disassembled. The guns were returned to standard anti-aircraft use, and the whole experiment was filed away as a footnote. But the men who'd seen it in action never forgot it. They told stories about it for years, about the gun that fired like 3, about the half-track that sounded like a platoon, about the day they watched a hillside fortress vanish in a cloud of dust and fire. Keller and Ruiz never met. They served on different islands, in different units, at different times. But they shared something. They'd both seen what happened when someone ignored the manual and tried something new. When someone looked at a weapon and asked, "What if we pushed it further?" The answers they found weren't clean. They weren't safe. And they weren't approved by anyone in a headquarters building. But they worked. And in a war where every advantage mattered, where every day alive was a victory, that was enough. The Thunder Machine and the Triple Mount were never celebrated in press releases or official histories. There were no medals awarded for their development, no parade floats, no museum displays. They existed in the margins, in the field reports written by exhausted officers who didn't have time to explain the details, in the maintenance logs that showed impossible barrel wear rates, in the letters home that mentioned a new kind of gun without giving specifics, and in the memories of the men who'd crewed them, who'd seen what they could do, and who understood that sometimes survival depends on breaking the rules. But the real lesson wasn't about the weapons. It was about the men who used them. Keller, the foreman who became a gunner. Ruiz, the mechanic who became a crew chief. They didn't invent anything. They didn't design anything. They just took what they were given, understood it deeply, and pushed it to its limit. They saw a problem and solved it, not with doctrine or theory, but with hands-on knowledge and a willingness to risk failure. That mindset, that ability to adapt and innovate under pressure, was what won battles. Not the guns, not the ammunition. The men. By the end of the war, both weapons had faded into obscurity. The explosive rounds were replaced by standard ball and tracer. The Triple Mount was scrapped for parts. And the innovations that had saved hundreds of lives were forgotten by everyone except the men who'd been there. Keller went back to Pennsylvania and never talked about the war. Ruiz went back to Los Angeles and opened a garage. They lived quiet lives, raised families, grew old, and when people asked them what they did in the war, they gave short, simple answers that didn't explain anything. Because how do you explain what it's like to fire a gun that sounds like thunder? How do you explain what it's like to watch 3 machine guns tear apart a hillside in seconds? How do you explain the weight of knowing that your innovation, your improvisation, was the difference between your friends living and dying? You don't. You just remember. And you carry it. The Thunder Machine and the Triple Mount weren't just weapons. They were proof that war doesn't wait for perfect solutions. It demands immediate ones. And the men who provide those solutions, who adapt and improvise and risk their lives testing ideas no one approved, are the ones who turn the tide, not with grand strategy or overwhelming force, but with ingenuity, courage, and a deep understanding of the tools in their hands. That's the lesson. That's what Keller and Ruiz understood. That's what saved lives. And that's what history, in its obsession with tanks and ships and generals, often forgets. The war was won by men who knew how machines worked, who weren't afraid to break them, and who understood that sometimes the best weapon isn't the one in the manual. It's the one you build yourself. But there's more to the story, because the impact of these weapons didn't end when the war did. The lessons they taught, the principles they demonstrated, echoed forward into every conflict that followed. The idea that standard weapons could be modified in the field, that innovation didn't require approval from headquarters, that desperate men with technical knowledge could change the outcome of battles, all of that became part of the American military tradition. It just took decades for anyone to acknowledge it. Korea, 1951. A young Army lieutenant named Robertson found himself staring at a problem that looked familiar. Chinese forces were attacking in human waves at night, overwhelming UN positions through sheer numbers. Machine gun fire was effective but not decisive. The enemy kept coming. Chun, who'd studied engineering at Berkeley before the war, started asking questions. What if we could make each bullet do more damage? What if we could make the gun more terrifying? He'd never heard of Howard Keller. He'd never heard of the Thunder Machine. But he was asking the same questions. And when he requisitioned incendiary rounds for his platoon's .30 caliber Brownings, he was following the same instinct. The modification worked. Chinese attacks on his sector stopped reaching the wire. Word spread. Other units tried it. And once again, an improvised weapon born from field necessity became a tactical advantage that headquarters would later try to take credit for. Vietnam, 1968. A Navy SEAL team was pinned down in the Mekong Delta by Viet Cong forces in fortified bunkers. Standard suppressive fire wasn't working. The bunkers were too strong. The VC too disciplined. The team's machine gunner, a former auto mechanic from Detroit named Marcus Webb, looked at his M60 and thought about rate of fire, about sustained fire, about what would happen if he removed the safety limiters and let the gun run at maximum cyclic rate. It would burn out faster. It would be dangerous. But it might buy them the time they needed to extract. He made the modification in the field using a knife and a pair of pliers. When the VC attacked again, Webb opened fire. The M60 screamed. It sounded wrong. Too fast. Too loud. But it worked. The volume of fire was so intense that the VC assault faltered. The SEALs escaped. And Webb's modification, unofficial and unauthorized as it was, got quietly adopted by other teams who faced similar situations. He'd never heard of Daniel Ruiz. He'd never heard of the Triple Mount. But he'd understood the same principle. Sometimes you have to break the weapon to save the men. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern. A tradition, almost, of men in combat looking at their tools and asking, how can I make this better? How can I make this more effective? How can I make this save lives? The answers were rarely elegant. They were usually dangerous. And they were almost never proved in advance. But they worked, because the men asking the questions understood their weapons at a level that no engineer in a lab ever could. They understood them in the context of survival, of fear, of desperation. And that understanding produced innovations that no amount of peacetime testing could replicate. The military establishment didn't like this. Improvised modifications were hard to control, hard to standardize, hard to integrate into doctrine. and they carried legal risks. If a modified weapon malfunctioned and killed friendly troops, who was responsible? The manufacturer? The soldier? The chain of command? It was easier to ban field modifications entirely, to insist that weapons be used exactly as designed. And for the most part, that's what happened. Official policy discouraged improvisation. Maintenance manuals were written to prevent it, and soldiers were trained to report, not repair. But in combat, official policy ran into reality, and reality won, because men under fire don't care about legal liability. They care about survival. And if a modification gives them a better chance of going home, they'll make it, every time. Keller would have understood this. So would Ruiz, because they'd lived it. They'd made the choice to test an untested idea because the alternative was watching their friends die. That choice, repeated across decades and conflicts, became the hidden backbone of American military effectiveness. Not the equipment, not the training, the willingness of individual soldiers to adapt, improvise, and take risks that no officer would ever officially approve. It's the part of war that doesn't fit into history books. The part that's too messy, too unauthorized, too dependent on individual initiative to be celebrated. But it's real, and it matters. By the 1980s, the military began to acknowledge this quietly. Special operations units were given more latitude to modify their weapons. Armorers were trained not just to maintain equipment, but to customize it. And research programs were started to study what soldiers were doing in the field and why. The Thunder Machine and the Triple Mount were never mentioned by name, but their legacy was everywhere. In the M1919 saw with its quick-change barrel design for sustained fire. In the MK19 grenade launcher that delivered explosive firepower at machine gun rates. In the modern doctrine that emphasized suppression, volume of fire, and psychological effect over pinpoint accuracy. These weapons didn't appear out of nowhere. They evolved from the lessons learned by men like Keller and Ruiz. Men who understood that sometimes the best way to improve a weapon is to push it past its design limits and see what happens. But there's a darker side to the story. Because not every improvisation worked. Not every risk paid off. For every Thunder Machine that saved lives, there was a weapon that failed. A modification that backfired. A soldier who paid the price for trying something new. History remembers the successes. It forgets the failures. And that imbalance creates a distorted picture. It makes innovation look easy, inevitable, safe. It wasn't. Keller could have been killed by an exploding barrel. Ruiz could have been killed by a mount failure. And countless other men, whose names we'll never know, were killed or maimed by modifications that didn't work. They took the same risks. They asked the same questions. They just didn't get lucky. And their stories were buried in incident reports and closed-door investigations that no historian will ever read. This is the cost of improvisation. The hidden cost. The men who died testing ideas. The men who were punished for breaking regulations, even when their modifications worked. The men who were quietly reassigned or discharged or court-martialed because they'd made command uncomfortable. Keller and Ruiz were lucky. They survived. Their weapons worked. And the tactical situation was desperate enough that no one questioned their methods too closely. But that luck wasn't guaranteed. And for every Keller, there were 10 men who tried something similar and failed, who were forgotten, who became cautionary tales whispered in maintenance shops and armories. Don't be like him. Don't take that risk. Follow the manual. Stay safe. The message was clear. Innovation is dangerous. Improvisation is punished. And the best way to survive the military is to do exactly what you're told. But men like Keller didn't think that way. They couldn't, because they understood something the manuals didn't. That safety is relative. That following procedure can get you killed just as easily as breaking it. That in combat, the greatest risk is often doing nothing. So they took the chance. They tested the idea. And when it worked, they didn't ask for permission to keep doing it. They just did it. Because lives depended on it, and that, more than any weapon or tactic, was what made them effective. The Thunder Machine fired its last rounds sometime in late 1945. No one recorded the exact date. No one took a photo. The gun was probably turned into a supply depot, inspected, and either rebuilt for standard use or scrapped for parts. The explosive ammunition was likely dumped in the ocean or buried in a landfill, and Keller walked away without looking back. He'd done his job. He'd kept his men alive, and now it was time to go home. He didn't talk about the gun afterward, didn't write about it, didn't seek recognition. When veterans groups asked him to speak at reunions, he declined. When historians tracked him down in the 1970s for oral history projects, he gave short, factual answers that revealed nothing about what he'd felt or feared or understood. He was done. The war was over, and the Thunder Machine for him was just a tool he'd used and then set down. Ruiz was the same way. After Saipan, he served through the rest of the campaign. Tinian, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, he crewed different weapons, fixed broken equipment, kept half-tracks running under impossible conditions. But he never worked on another triple mount. It was a one-time thing, a battlefield experiment that succeeded once and was never repeated. When he came home, he opened his garage and spent 40 years fixing cars. He was good at it, patient, precise. He treated every engine like it mattered, because to him, it did. He never mentioned the war, unless asked directly. And when people did ask, he'd say, "I was a mechanic, fixed trucks mostly," which was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that he crewed the most devastating anti-personnel weapon in the Pacific Theater for 3 weeks and watched it tear through enemy positions like they were made of paper. But that wasn't a story you told at a backyard barbecue. So he didn't. Both men died in the 1990s. Keller in Pennsylvania, Ruiz in California. Both had families. Both had quiet funerals. Both were buried with military honors, a folded flag and a 3-volley salute. The honors were for their service, not for their innovation, not for the lives they'd saved, not for the risks they'd taken, just for showing up and doing their duty, which, in a way, was fitting, because that's how they saw themselves. Not as heroes, not as inventors, just as men who'd done what needed to be done. But their legacy didn't die with them. It lives on every time a soldier in a forward operating base looks at a broken weapon and figures out how to fix it with duct tape and wire. Every time a squad improvises a new tactic because the textbook solution isn't working. Every time a young private asks, "What if we tried this instead?" and an experienced sergeant says, "Let's find out." That spirit, curious, pragmatic, unafraid, is the inheritance Keller and Ruiz left behind. Not a weapon, not a manual, a mindset, the understanding that war rewards those who adapt, who think, who aren't afraid to break the rules when the rules aren't working. That mindset has saved more lives than any gun ever could, and it will keep saving lives long after the last veteran of World War II is gone. So when you hear about the Thunder Machine or the Triple Mount or any of the hundreds of improvised weapons that never made it into official histories, remember this. They weren't miracles. They weren't accidents. They were the result of men who understood their tools deeply, who faced impossible situations, and who chose to take a risk rather than accept defeat. That choice is what separates survival from death in combat, and it's what separates a military that can adapt from one that can't. The American military, for all its flaws, has always had men like Keller and Ruiz, men who don't wait for orders, who don't need permission, who see a problem and solve it, consequences be damned. That's the real weapon, not the gun, the man behind it. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below.